The neon sign for Kemp's 24/7 diner hummed faintly, its glow casting a flickering pink light across the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. Tom squinted through the drizzle as he locked his bike to a rusting pole. He glanced at the diner's windows, where condensation blurred the silhouettes of a few late-night customers. It looked harmless enough, just another relic of a town long past its prime. Mrs. Kemp was waiting inside. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "You ever worked in food service before?" she asked, a cigarette dangling from her thin lips. Her voice had the rough edge of someone who'd been chain-smoking for decades. "A little," Tom lied. He didn't want to admit he'd spent the last 6 months scraping by on freelance writing gigs and bad luck. Mrs. Kemp grunted and shoved a laminated list into his hands. "Then this won't be too hard. Follow the rules, keep the place clean, and don't piss off the regulars." The rules were printed in bold, blocky letters, but as Tom skimmed them, his eyebrows furrowed. 1. Always wear gloves when cleaning the back booth. 2. Lock the doors immediately if a red truck pulls into the parking lot after 2 a.m. 3. Never sit at table 7 after midnight. 4. Do not touch the jukebox between 1 and 4 a.m. And 5. If the light above table 13 starts flickering, take your break immediately. "What is this?" Tom asked, smirking. "Some kind of hazing ritual for the new guy?" Mrs. Kemp's gaze hardened. "Do I look like someone who jokes?" She tapped the laminated sheet with a nicotine-stained finger. "You follow these, to the letter. Don't ask why." Tom's smirk faltered under her glare. "All right, got it. Good." She crushed her cigarette in an overflowing ashtray and gestured toward the kitchen. "Your shift's 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. I expect the place spotless by the time the day crew shows up. Don't screw it up." The first few hours passed uneventfully. Tom scrubbed down counters, refilled coffee pots, and avoided the greasy grill where the cook, an unfriendly older man named Gus, scowled at everything and everyone. The only real oddity was the back booth. It was larger than the others, tucked away in the far corner beneath a dusty ceiling fan. The faint smell of bleach lingered there, and the table's surface was so clean it gleamed under the fluorescence. It seemed Mrs. Kemp took Rule #1 very seriously. By midnight, the diner had emptied out, leaving only Tom and Gus. The cook leaned against the counter, arms crossed, staring at the clock. "Time for me to clock out," Gus said flatly. "You're on your own, kid." "Wait, what if—" "Don't bother calling me unless someone's bleeding out." Gus grabbed his coat and headed for the door. He paused, looking back at Tom with a frown. "Don't forget the rules." Then he was gone, leaving Tom alone with the silence. Around 1 a.m., the light above table 13 began to flicker. Tom glanced up from the stack of menus he was organizing and sighed. "Guess it's break time," he muttered, recalling Rule #5. He sat behind the counter, scrolling on his phone, when he heard the chime of the front door. He looked up to see a man in dusty overalls and a cowboy hat standing in the doorway. The man's face was mostly obscured by shadow, but his presence sent a chill crawling up Tom's spine. We're open," Tom called hesitantly. The man nodded and walked past him, boots clunking heavily on the tiles. He went straight to table 7 and sat down, folding his hands neatly on the table. Tom froze. Never sit at table 7 after midnight. He hesitated, torn between following the rules and doing his job. Surely this was just a coincidence, a harmless local superstition, nothing more. With a deep breath, he grabbed a menu and approached. "Coffee to start?" Tom asked, his voice wavering slightly. The man didn't respond. He didn't even look at Tom. Instead, he pointed to the jukebox in the corner. "No touching the jukebox between 1 and 4 a.m., Tom muttered under his breath. "Sorry, it's out of order right now." The man finally turned his head, and Tom felt his stomach drop. The stranger's face was unnaturally pale, his features blurred like an overexposed photograph. His eyes seemed to glint, though there was no light in them. "Coffee," the man said, his voice low and hollow. Tom nodded quickly and retreated to the counter. He poured a cup with trembling hands and carried it back to table 7. The man accepted the mug without a word. Tom tried to distract himself by cleaning, but his gaze kept drifting back to the booth. The man didn't drink the coffee. He just sat there, staring at something only he could see. And then, at exactly 2:13 a.m., the light above table 13 stopped flickering. The diner fell silent. No hum from the lights, no faint clatter from the kitchen. Just silence. "Hello," Tom called out. The man at table 7 slowly stood, his movements unnaturally stiff. He turned toward Tom, and in the dim light, his face looked sharper, darker. "Time's up," the man said. Before Tom could respond, the front door swung open, and a gust of icy wind swept through the diner. Outside, a red truck idled in the parking lot, its headlights glowing faintly through the fog. Tom's breath hitched as he stared out the window at the red truck. Its paint was dull and chipped, the chrome bumper smeared with something dark and oily. The headlights barely illuminated the parking lot, but the truck's engine rumbled like a low growl. He stumbled back toward the counter, trying to remember rule #2. Lock the doors immediately if a red truck pulls into the parking lot after 2 a.m. His feet felt like lead, his limbs slow as though moving underwater. His pulse hammered in his ears. "Move, Tom! Lock the door!" He reached the entrance just as the diner's bell jingled again. He froze. The cowboy was still at table 7 moments ago, but now the booth was empty and the man was standing in the doorway. I need to lock up," Tom stammered, his fingers brushing the latch. "You can't lock him out," the man said, his voice rasping like sandpaper. "He's already here." Tom backed away. "What the hell are you talking about?" The cowboy didn't answer. Instead, he turned his head slowly toward the truck. His shadow stretched unnaturally long across the linoleum floor, reaching the counter and climbing the walls. The truck's engine cut off, its headlights dimmed, leaving the parking lot bathed in darkness. The diner lights buzzed faintly, flickering just enough to make the shadows seem alive. The cowboy stepped closer to Tom. Up close, his face was even worse than Tom had realized. His features seemed to blur and sharpen in turns, his expression flickering between grim and grotesquely grinning. "Do you know this place, kid?" he asked. Tom shook his head. I just started working here." The cowboy's smile widened. "Then you've got no idea what you've done." "What are you talking about?" Tom demanded, his voice cracking. The cowboy pointed at table 7, where the empty coffee cup now sat upright, steaming faintly. "You let him in." Before Tom could respond, the diner's lights went out. Darkness swallowed the room, broken only by the faint neon glow of the diner's sign. Tom fumbled for his phone, switching on the flashlight. The beam of light trembled as he swept it across the room. The cowboy was gone. "Hello?" Tom whispered. His voice echoed faintly, the sound bouncing off the walls as though the diner had grown larger. Then he heard it, the crunch of boots on gravel, coming from the parking lot. Tom crept to the window, his breath fogging the glass. The red truck's passenger door was open now, swinging gently in the wind. The driver's seat was empty, but muddy boot prints led away from the truck, toward the diner. Tom stumbled back, heart racing. The front door creaked open with a long, slow groan, and the air turned freezing cold. No, the flashlight in his trembling hand revealed the muddy prints trailing across the floor. They didn't belong to any boots Tom had ever seen. The toes were too long, the heel too narrow, and the marks had a faint, wet sheen, as though something was leaking from them. A low voice cut through the silence. "You broke the rules." Tom spun around. The cowboy was back, sitting at table 7. But he wasn't alone. Across from him sat a second figure, its form shrouded in darkness. The flashlight beam refused to settle on the figure's face. It flickered and danced as though the light itself was afraid. "What is this?" Tom choked out, clutching the counter for support. The cowboy leaned forward, his smile cruel and mocking. "This diner's been here a long time, kid. Longer than this town, longer than any of us. And there are rules for a reason." The shadowy figure across from him chuckled, a deep, guttural sound that made Tom's skin crawl. "Who are you?" Tom demanded, his voice rising in panic. The cowboy tilted his head toward the shadow. "Not me you need to worry about, kid." The shadow moved, its form unfurling like smoke. Tom's flashlight flickered violently as the figure rose to its full height, towering over the booth. Its face was a blur of shifting features, but its eyes glowed faintly, like dying embers. "I was invited," the shadow said, its voice a guttural snarl. "You opened the door." Tom stumbled back toward the kitchen. "This isn't real. This can't be real." The cowboy let out a sharp laugh. "Oh, it's real, all right. And now you're a part of it." "What do you want from me?" Tom cried, his back pressed against the swinging kitchen doors. The shadow loomed closer, its form twisting and writhing like a living storm cloud. "You will learn. You will serve." "No!" Tom bolted into the kitchen, slamming the doors behind him. He grabbed the landline phone on the wall, but the line was dead. The buzzing of the kitchen's fluorescent lights grew louder and louder, drowning out his frantic thoughts. Then it stopped. Tom hesitated, his breath hitching. He peeked through the kitchen door window. The diner was empty. The cowboy was gone. The shadow was gone. Even the red truck had vanished from the parking lot. The only sign that anything had happened was the coffee cup still sitting on the table 7, steam curling up into the now silent diner. Tom sank to the floor, trembling. His phone buzzed in his pocket. When he pulled it out, a single text message glowed on the screen. "Rule #7. You can't quit." The words on Tom's phone screen seemed to pulse, burning themselves into his mind. "Rule #7. You can't quit." His hands trembled as he set the phone down, staring blankly at the diner through the kitchen door's tiny window. It looked normal now. Clean booths, polished counters, and fluorescent lights humming softly. The coffee cup on table 7 had stopped steaming, the liquid inside gone cold. Tom felt a flicker of relief. Maybe he'd imagined it all. Maybe the stress of moving to a new town and taking this strange job had finally gotten to him. Then his phone buzzed again. "Clock back in. He's not done with you yet." The message came from an unknown number, but Tom recognized the cowboy's voice in the words. A sharp knock on the back door made him jump. He turned slowly, dread prickling the back of his neck. "Delivery!" a gruff voice called from the other side. Tom hesitated, his gut screaming at him not to move. But another knock, louder this time, sent a jolt through him. Against his better judgment, he approached the door. Sliding back the bolt, he opened it a crack. A delivery man stood outside, his uniform faded and stained, his face hidden beneath the brim of a cap. He held a large crate stamped with the diner's logo. "This yours?" the man asked, his tone flat. "What's in it?" Tom asked warily. "Don't know, don't care." The man shoved the crate forward. "Boss's orders, handle with care." Before Tom could protest, the delivery man turned and walked away, his figure fading into the shadows of the alley behind the diner. Tom stared at the crate. It looked old, the wood weathered and splintered, as though it had been sitting in storage for years. A faint smell of mildew wafted from it. Dragging the crate inside, Tom placed it on the counter. Stamped across the top in bold faded letters were the words, "Property of Kemp's Diner." He pried the lid open with a butter knife, his breath catching as he revealed the contents. Inside were neatly folded papers, old photographs, and a leather-bound journal. A thick layer of dust covered everything, and the air smelled faintly of something metallic and sour. Tom picked up one of the photographs. It showed the diner as it had been decades ago. Brand new, its neon sign glowing brightly. Behind the counter stood a young Mrs. Kemp, smiling stiffly. Beside her was a man in a cowboy hat, his face blurry and indistinct. A note was tucked beneath the photo. Tom unfolded it with shaking hands. The first rule wasn't about gloves. It was about blood. Tom's stomach churned. He rifled through the journal, flipping past pages of tightly scrawled handwriting. The words were cryptic, rambling, references to the man in the hat. the shadow in the booth, and the price of breaking the rules. One passage stood out, circled several times in dark ink. He watches from table 7. The rules keep him contained. Break them, and the debt becomes yours. The room seemed to grow colder as Tom read. He turned the page and found a detailed sketch of the shadowy figure he'd seen earlier. Beneath it, written in bold letters, were the words, "Do not let him in." Tom's head spun. The diner, the rules, the strange occurrences. It was all connected to the man in the cowboy hat in the shadow. Mrs. Kemp had known. She'd always known. The bell above the front door jingled, breaking the silence. Tom froze. He peeked through the kitchen door's window. A single figure stood in the middle of the diner. It wasn't the cowboy or the shadow. It was a woman, older, with a thin frame and graying hair pulled into a tight bun. She wore a threadbare coat and clutched a large purse to her chest. Her eyes scanned the diner nervously before landing on the counter. "Mrs. Kemp," Tom whispered, his heart racing. She looked different, older, frailer, but it was unmistakably her. "Tom," she said, her voice trembling, "we need to talk." Tom stepped cautiously into the dining area, his pulse hammering in his ears. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded. Mrs. Kemp's eyes darted to table 7. She shuddered. "You broke the rules, didn't you?" "I didn't mean to," Tom snapped. "You didn't explain anything. What is this place? Who was that thing at the table?" She sighed heavily, sinking into a booth far from table 7. "You should have listened. You should have left that man alone." Tom clenched his fists. "Just tell me what's happening." Mrs. Kemp hesitated, her gaze fixed on the empty coffee cup at table 7. "This diner isn't just a diner," she began. "It's a tether, a place that keeps him tied down." "Him?" Tom asked. "The man in the hat," she whispered. "And what follows him?" "They've been here since the diner opened. Maybe longer. The rules keep them contained, keep us safe. But when you break the rules," she trailed off, her hands trembling. Tom swallowed hard. "What happens if I break them?" Her eyes met his, filled with guilt and fear. "You inherit the debt. You take my place." Tom staggered back, his head spinning. "What are you talking about?" Mrs. Kemp stood slowly, clutching her purse like a lifeline. "I've been bound to this place for 50 years. I was hoping to retire soon. Pass it on to someone new, but now it's your turn." "No." Tom shook his head. "No, you can't do this. I didn't ask for this." Mrs. Kemp walked to the door, her frail figure framed by the neon glow outside. "I didn't ask for it either." With that, she stepped out into the night, leaving Tom alone in the diner. The bell jingled again. Tom turned toward the sound, his blood running cold. The cowboy was back, sitting at the table 7. He smiled, tipping his hat. "Welcome to the job, kid." He